what's really happened at the universities over the last 25 years is that mostly they've grown on the administration side. Yeah. Like if you look at the charts, it's ridiculous. The administration costs have just ratcheted themselves up to a point where it's ridiculous. It's become, I would say, it's like an indentured servitude scam. So you could imagine that for a long time when you went to university, essentially what you were doing was increasing the value of your future earnings. Well, the universities basically figured out how to capture the future earnings of their students by ramping up the tuition costs. And then all the tuition costs didn't even go to profit. They went to administrative overhead. And there's just no excuse for it. Like, there's no reason that has to be the case. And so, well, it isn't the case with Peterson Academy, and so we can bring extremely high quality education to people at a very low cost.
I'm interested in what you said earlier. You said you're not going to compromise for like accreditation.
Yes.
Is there a lot of corruption with those crediting agencies? There's got to be, right?
Well, there's ideological corruption.
They're not just going to give a credit out and kind of threaten the whole system that's already going
well,
on, right?
they're also, the universities are so captured ideologically that it's a scandal. I mean, there are no conservatives at all in universities. I mean, there's a couple of conservative universities, Hillsdale College, for example, which is an outstanding educational institution.
Where's that?
It's in Michigan and in a little town. And so it's not for everyone, but I went to Hillsdale a couple of times and I talked to a lot of the students and they told me that 90% of the professors were excellent. That's very rare. They have a 1% first-year dropout rate. 1%. The typical first-year dropout rate is 40%, which is, well,
wow.
That's also an indication of the scandalous state of the universities. But they're just too expensive and there's no excuse for it, especially given the technology that we have at hand. And so,
why do you think it's gotten there? Like you talked a little bit earlier, you mentioned about the woke sort of mindset that's injected into like these institutions. Why do you think it's gotten to that point? And also,
well, I think what's happened fundamentally, and this happens to institutions in general, is that imagine that you build up something that has reputational and brand value because it's actually delivering a credible service. I think you could make the case that for many years the universities did a good job, of selecting students so that you could be reasonably certain. So for example, at Harvard, most of the value of a Harvard degree was actually the fact that you were accepted at the university, right? Because the criteria for acceptance were so high that an employer could be reasonably certain, this is true for MBA programs too, that at minimum you were much smarter than average. And that's definitely something that you want when you're hiring someone, especially for a complicated position. And then the universities did a credible job of educating people. And so they built up a tremendous brand value. Like the Harvard brand value is through the roof, although they've compromised it terribly in the last 4 or 5 years. But what happens when you build up an institution that has tremendous brand value is that the parasites can swoop in and take advantage of it. And certainly that's what's happened with the like woke grievance study mob of false disciplines that have invaded the university, and they're almost all political actors. And you can start to turn the brand value to your own purposes, which is what's happened with the multiplication of administrators. You know, you ramp up the value of the students. They have a certain pool of future earnings. You can turn those future earnings to your own purposes by ramping up the tuition costs.
So on that, right? Yeah. The ideological idea of like people going, okay, we have this sort of structure and now I'm taking what I can from it instead of like giving what I should be giving to it back to it.
Same things happen in companies like Disney.
How do you, because is it an ideological thing or is it a human thing? Because so for this instance, right, I'm not saying you be the person that, you know, let's say you get your academy to this certain level and then you do the same thing. I'm not saying you do that, but
it's
my
very
question,
likely.
So my question is like, is it a human thing or is it an ideological thing? Because
that's a very good question, actually. I would say most fundamentally, it's a sociological phenomenon that's not immediately linked to ideology. And so, well, one of the things we know, for example, is that the typical family fortune lasts about 3 generations and the typical Fortune 500 company about 30 years. And it's because it's hard for a company to stay on the cutting edge and current mean, you know with your own enterprise that if you're not, you have to be very aware of where the environment is shifting so that you stay on the cutting edge of the communication technology. You have to know the algorithms. You have to know what's current and hot. You have to stay on that edge. And it's hard to do that for a long period of time. And then you also have, here's another terrible problem. It's a very cool thing to understand, although it's a dreadful fact. So there's a law of creative production called the Pareto rule. And the Pareto rule, sometimes you hear it characterized as the 80-20 rule. 20% of your customers will give you 80% of your business. But it's, or 20% of your employees do 80% of the work. But it's way worse than that. Like, that's just a shorthand version of the law. The actual law is the square root of the number of people involved in an enterprise do half the work. Okay, so here's what that means. If you have 10 people that work for you, 3 of them do half the work. Now that seems pretty understandable, right? If you have 100, 10 of them do half the work. And if you have 10,000, 100 of them do half the work. And so what that means is that as your enterprise grows, the number of people who are engaging in counterproductive activity scales much faster than the number of people who are being productive.